What's going on, guys? Let me ask you something. As someone heavily involved with preparedness and emergency services, and most importantly, as one American talking to another, what if the thing we keep telling ourselves, the could never happen here, already is? As I'm sure you're aware, right now, just a few hundred miles south of our border, Mexico is living through something that looks less like crime and more like a parallel system rising inside a country that's struggling to contain it. And the real question, the one nobody wants to say out loud, is this: could the United States be on that same trajectory? I'm not saying tomorrow or even within the next couple of years. I'm not trying to play into any sort of hysteria with the whole situation or anything like that. But could we get there eventually? This is something I've paid particular attention to for a pretty long time, mainly because one of the big sheriffs down here in Maryland, Sheriff Mike Lewis, does an incredible presentation on this topic, which piqued my interest into what is going on down there on a pretty consistent basis. Before we even touch the US, we need to understand the mechanics of what's happening in Mexico, because what we are seeing, it's not uncoordinated chaos. It's not random. It's not just cartels being cartels. This is a structured system, a shadow government in some regions with a shadow economy and a shadow justice system. The cartels aren't just trafficking drugs. They're out there collecting taxes. They're enforcing their laws. They're settling disputes. They're providing jobs, and they're filling gaps where the state is just either too weak or completely absent. This is what analysts call parallel power. When a non-state actor starts performing the functions of a state, and once that happens, once people start to rely on that instead of the government, they're not really a criminal group anymore. They're an institution. Mexico didn't get here overnight. It's the result of four forces converging. The first being institutional weakness, not total collapse, just enough corruption, enough fragmentation, enough inconsistency that criminal networks can operate with confidence. Two is having a massive illicit economy, billions of dollars flowing through narcotics, extortion, fuel theft, human smuggling, money that rivals or even surpasses legitimate industries. Third is just demographic pressure. Mexico certainly has a young population with very limited economic mobility. Millions of young men with very few opportunities and a lot of recruitment pressure from the cartels. And then fourth, and probably the worst part, is their geography. A border with the world's largest drug consuming market. That's us. Put those together and you get a country where the state is still there, but it's not the only legitimate power anymore. Now, here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. The United States is not Mexico. Different history, different institutions, completely different economy. But the conditions that allow parallel power to grow, those conditions are not unique to Mexico. And if you really look, some of them are starting to appear here. Not at the same scale, not with the same intensity as in Mexico, but the early indicators, they're real. If we're looking at the warning signs that are already showing themselves here, we can start to recognize this larger picture that is forming. First thing being parallel influence, not control, but influence. Fortunately enough, we don't have cartels controlling territory, but we do have cartel-linked networks operating inside U.S. cities. We have trafficking corridors. We have gangs acting as franchise partners with the cartels. We have border infrastructure that is much, much better now than it was. But for a period of time, it was completely overwhelmed. Now, this isn't territorial control, but it is parallel influence. The second thing is institutional strain. Our institutions are stronger than Mexico's. Yep, there's no question about that. But they're not invincible. Look at everything that has happened and the efforts that are in place right here in very recent history. We're seeing in real time declining trust in law enforcement, political polarization affecting policing, inconsistent prosecutions, overloaded courts, and cities that are really struggling to maintain order in specific neighborhoods. And with that, you have to come to the realization that institutions, they don't collapse all at once. They erode slowly and then suddenly. And then third would be the expanding illicit economies, fentanyl, human trafficking, black market labor, literal underground economies in major cities. These aren't fringe issues anymore. They're becoming structural. And whenever there's money, there's power. And wherever there's power, someone will try to control it. Finally, is the demographic pressure. We've all been witness to these massive inflows of migrants. Many of them, young men arriving with no support structure, no economic foothold, and no path into the formal economy. That does nothing but create the same vulnerabilities these networks exploit in Mexico. Pick any sanctuary city you want, research their crime data, and see for yourself. Again, it's not identical to Mexico, but it's very familiar situations. If this trajectory continued, and I'm not saying it will, I mean, God willing, hopefully not, but if it did, it wouldn't look just like what we're seeing in Mexico. It would look like an American version of what's happening there. Something like, seeing pockets of ungoverned space inside major cities, criminal networks being embedded in migrant flows, local governments losing capacity, federal and state governments fighting over enforcement, rising corruption at the municipal level, and parallel economies that operate outside the law. Not a complete collapse, not a takeover, a slow fragmentation. And if you think about that, tell me we aren't seeing a lot of this already, that the pieces, they're coming together. And if they organize, we'll get a country where the official system still exists, but it's not the only system anymore. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. No nation is immune to any of this, not even us. Now, possibly even worse, you could argue that letting institutions strain, letting borders overwhelm, letting illicit economies grow really creates the perfect conditions for a new kind of power to rise. Not necessarily cartels, maybe just something else, something quieter, something more organized, something that benefits from chaos, from confusion, from fragmentation, because power doesn't always expand by force. Sometimes it expands by letting the system weaken just enough that the people start looking for alternatives. And I'm not saying that is what's happening, because I get it. It's a little conspiratorial, and we are dedicated to keeping this channel grounded in reality. But I think it's a question worth asking, and I'm definitely interested to hear your thoughts on it now that I've kind of presented it in that fashion. So in closing, I think the real question isn't, could it happen? The real question we have to be asking ourselves is, are we paying attention early enough to stop it? Because once a parallel system takes root, once people start relying on something other than the state, once the shadow becomes as real as the institution, it's almost impossible to put that genie back in the bottle. Now, look, if you found this video helpful or uncomfortable, that was kind of the point of me making it. There's a lot going on right now, and we can't fix what we refuse to look at, and we can't protect what we pretend is invincible. So, guys, thanks for being here. Stay aware, stay curious, and stay engaged, because the future doesn't just happen. It's built or ignored one decision at a time. And with that, we'll see you on the next one. Stay safe.